"Sir, if they come, don't leave my sister." The boy said it with both hands locked around Eli Mercer's stirrup leather, while dust lifted off the north road in a thin yellow ribbon that meant riders were coming and had chosen the Talley place on purpose. The yard smelled of iron water and sun-baked sage. The windmill Eli had spent the morning repairing turned with a tired scrape over the well, and on the porch a woman stood with a shotgun held low against her skirt, not raising it, not lowering it, as if stillness itself might keep the day from breaking open. The boy was all wrists and worry, no more than 11, with a healing split in his lip and the flat, careful voice of a child who had already learned that panic makes adults less useful, not more. Behind him the woman said, "Ben, let him decide without hanging on him." And though her tone stayed level, Eli heard the strain underneath it, the way a horse hears wire sing before it gives. He had meant to leave after dinner. That had been the whole bargain. He had ridden in the evening before to ask water for his gelding, found the pump rod bent and the bay mare lame from a thrown shoe, and traded a day's work for supper and a corner of the lean-to. Men who lived out of saddlebags learned to keep their names light and their departures early. He had a winter job waiting down near Springer, remount work for a freight outfit, steady pay for the first time in 2 years if he reached it by Sunday. He had been counting on it with the quiet hunger only drifters understand. Then the boy had caught his stirrup with fear in both hands, and fear always reached a place in Eli that money never had. The woman came down off the porch. Nora Talley, he had heard Ben call her. Sun and labor had pared her face clean of softness without making it hard. Her dress was faded blue, sleeves rolled, one cuff still dark with grease from helping him at the pump. She had pinned her hair for work, not beauty, and there was something in the way she held her shoulders that told him she had spent a long time refusing to fold where life meant her to. "If you've got somewhere you need to be," she said, "go." Ben's fingers tightened. Eli looked past them to the road, where 3 riders were becoming 4. No man riding past a poor place came in a straight line for the house. He swung down from the saddle, and the boy's breath left him in one relieved little gust. If you're listening tonight with your coffee near to hand or your supper plate not quite cleared, tell me where this finds you from, because there are Talley places in more parts of the world than maps bother honoring. And there has never yet been a lonely road that didn't one day carry somebody's trouble right up to the door. Eli pulled the saddle from his gelding and hung it over the rail. "Those Voss hands?" he asked. Nora gave one short nod. "Most likely." He asked why most likely, and she said, "Because decent men wave before they ride into a widow's yard." That told him enough to know there had already been seasons of this. A widow, no man in the house, trouble old enough to stop feeling new and start feeling permanent. Ben vanished into the kitchen and came back with a coffee can full of nails because boys like him always reached first for the tool nearest their fear. Nora stood in the yard with empty hands, which somehow made her seem braver than if she had leveled the shotgun. "Mr. Mercer, I'm not going to tell you it's no business of yours," she said. "It may be in another minute. I just won't lie to you while there's still time not to." "What does Harlan Voss want?" Eli asked. "Our spring. Our lower meadow. The crossing where the county road narrows. All the things my father was fool enough to settle on before somebody rich decided they mattered." The wind shifted and brought the mineral scent of water from the draw below the house. Not much by the smell of it, but steady. In dry country, steady was fortune. Nora told him her father had taken a note during a fever winter, paid on it, then died. Her husband had kept paying until influenza took him too. After that, Voss had bought the note and begun finding new ways for the debt to grow faster than any widow stock could. There it was. Not bandits from a dime novel, just paper, money, and a man accustomed to being believed. Harlan Voss rode into the yard on a red roan, younger than Eli had pictured, broad-shouldered and neat in every practical thing a working rancher usually lets go shabby. His beard was trimmed close, his boots well made, his expression so calm and careless I might have mistaken him for reasonable. The 3 men with him spread just enough to say threat without speaking it. One held his reins too tight. One wore a rawhide quirt looped round his wrist. The third, hollow-eyed and young, kept his gaze off Nora altogether. Men ashamed of their work did not always stop doing it. They only learned to sleep badly after. Voss looked Eli over, then Nora. Mrs. Talley, he said. I rode out because I'd rather settle matters civil than with county paper. Word is you've taken to hiring help. I hired a day's labor, Nora answered. You rode out with 4 men. Which of us is worried? One of the riders almost laughed and thought better of it. Voss did not change expression. He said she had until Saturday. After that he would return with Sheriff Cutter and Peebles from the bank to inventory whatever remained against the debt. Nora said her father's note was not forfeit and her husband had not let anything stand except a coffin when influenza took him. Voss answered with a little shrug that made arithmetic sound like weather. Then he turned his attention to Eli and offered him winter work, better wages than any widow could pay, the kind of smooth invitation a man gives when he assumes every soul has a price if named alongside the proper fear. I'm not hunting work from a man who rides into a woman's yard to count her chairs before he owns them, Eli said. Voss's face cooled by a degree. Saturday, then? He touched the brim of his hat to Nora, not courteous at all, more like a thumb laid on property, and wheeled away. The dust of them hung in the yard after they left. Ben spoke first. He came last month with 1 rider and broke Pa's branding table for kindling. Nora shut her eyes for 1 heartbeat. That was enough. Eli carried his saddle to the lean-to instead of back to the horse. He took his rifle from its scabbard, checked the chamber, and laid it across the porch rail. I'll stay through Saturday, he said. Nora asked what happened after that. He looked at the leaning fence posts, the tired windmill, the thin boy, the woman still refusing to shake where anyone could see. We make sure there's still a place worth staying at on Sunday. The choosing ought to have ended there. It did not. Half an hour later, while Eli and Ben dragged the wagon to narrow the open side of the yard and give cover if shots came, smoke rose black from the lower meadow. Nora ran before either of them had time to think. Eli followed with the taste of green hay burning already bitter in his throat. The winter stack near the spring had gone up clean and fast, flame chewing inward through feed that had taken all summer to cure and stack by hand. There was no lightning in a blank white sky. No accident. They fought the fire with buckets and wet canvas until Eli's palms blistered on the well rope and Nora's sleeves turned black to the elbow. But a haystack burns the way a grudge burns, from the heart out. What they saved was the yard, not the feed. When the last of the flame sagged into smoking ruin, Eli stood bent over and looked at what Voss had actually done. He had not just threatened a debt. He had reached months ahead into winter hunger and laid a hand there first. Nora wiped soot from her mouth and said, without self-pity and without drama, "Now it's your business." There are moments when a man understands that riding away later will not count as innocence, only lateness. Eli knew that kind of lateness too well. Years earlier, his younger sister Lucy had told him to go on and take a trail job while she managed their fever-struck mother at home. He had believed her because he wanted to. By the time he returned, wanting had changed nothing. So when Ben had begged him not to leave Nora, the words had struck a place already hollowed by old regret. Before dawn the ruined hay would be common talk from Dry Creek to town, and there would be no pretending now that he had only stopped for water. The next morning Nora had the wagon hitched before sunup. "We go to town," she said. "Peebles told my father one thing when the note was signed. He may deny it now. I'd rather make him deny it where walls can hear." Ben climbed into the back among feed sacks and spare harness, touching the cut on his lip only when he thought the others were not looking. The road to Dry Creek ran through brown grass and a ribbon of cottonwoods where cicadas rasped in the heat. Eli sat beside Nora with the rifle between his knees and watched her hands on the lines. Capable hands. A white scar crossed the base of her thumb. When she caught him seeing it, she said, "Knife slipped skinning a yearling." As if she'd rather answer the question than let him shape private myths from it. A mile later, while tightening the brake chain on a slope, she said almost to the mules, "Wire only holds if both ends mean it." Eli looked at her. "About fence." She kept her eyes on the road. "About most things worth keeping." Dry Creek was one broad street, 2 false front rows, a church that leaned west, and enough pride to make up for the lack of size. The blacksmith, Ruiz lifted 2 fingers from his anvil when Nora drove past. The mercantile keeper's wife noticed the soot on Nora's sleeves and looked away out of politeness that did not hide concern. Inside the bank, Mr. Peebles came from behind his counter with the careful smile of a man who prefers all pain to arrive stamped and signed. Nora laid her father's receipts before him and said plainly that he had promised the note would remain in-house and the rate unchanged if the payments stayed current through calving season. Peebles touched the paper but did not open it. He spoke of debt instruments changing hands, of private holders and unfortunate weather, until Eli said, "That mean Voss bought a starving man's note and fattens on it now?" Peebles colored and began to object to rough talk in his establishment. Then Harlan Voss walked in with Sheriff Cutter beside him. Carrying a handsome leather ledger, he sat on the counter like a priest laying down a Bible. Cutter was a chair-grown man with a pale mustache and the lazy eyes of someone who believed the law should save its energy for the already powerful. Voss said every payment was entered, every advance for feed and medicine noted, every term enforceable. Nora made him open the book. Columns stood neat as fence pickets. Eli could not read figures as quickly as she could, but he saw the change come over her. First disbelief, then a sharp, intelligent kind of anger. "You added storage fees against cattle never kept in your pens," she said, "and breeding charges after my bull died." Voss called them standard assumptions where records were incomplete. Nora said the records were incomplete because his rider had chopped up her branding table. Sheriff Cutter told her to mind her tone. People had begun collecting at the doorway by then. Ruiz wiping his hands. The telegraph girl pretending to pass by slow. Mrs. Doherty from the mercantile with flour still dusting her sleeve. Towns like that grow a conscience by overhearing it into existence. Nora put both hands on the counter and leaned toward Cutter. "My tone is the least expensive thing in this room, Sheriff. If you mean to help him take my place, take it. But don't ask me to sweeten my voice while you do it." Silence answered. Then Cutter said the inventory would proceed Saturday at the Talley place. If she had legal objections, she could present them then. It sounded official. It also sounded like a man hoping the matter would stay safely unfair in private. Outside, Ruiz murmured to Nora that he had spare wire if her north fence came down again. Mrs. Doherty slipped an extra sack of salt into the wagon and charged her for one. At the pump, the telegraph girl whispered that a Santa Fe survey crew had spent 2 days studying the road crossing below Talley Spring. "Didn't know if that mattered," she said. It mattered plenty. Voss did not merely want a widow's meadow. He wanted the crossing before the railroad wanted it too. On the ride home, the air felt drier, the silence more crowded. Ben asked if burned hay counted as a legal objection. Neither adult answered. The wagon hit a rut and Nora steadied the team without looking at Eli. "He knew before he bought the note," she said at last. "About the crossing," Eli said likely. "There's nothing uglier than a man who calls appetite foresight." When the house came into sight, Eli saw at once that the barn door stood wider than they had left it. He stopped the wagon with a hand on Nora's wrist. Inside, the bay mare was gone, and so was the little chest Ben said held their deed copies, their mother's Bible, and every paper too important for daily use. Nora stood in the barn doorway and let herself go still in that dangerous way some people do when rage has nowhere clean to land. "Saturday's coming faster than I planned," she said. "And before we ride into what came next, answer this for yourself. When fear arrives wearing money, a badge, and the habit of being obeyed, what do you protect first, your safety, your pride, or the one thing you know you won't respect yourself for surrendering?" Folks answer that question with their mouths every day. Their real answer shows up in the next thing they do. What they did was work. Eli rest-rung the north fence with Ruiz's wire while Ben fetched staples and tried not to glance toward the empty stall. Nora turned the house through for any paper Voss had missed and finally came down from the top shelf with an old flour tin full of odds and ends her father had squirreled away. Inside were seed receipts, a broken watch chain, 3 peach pits polished smooth by her mother's thumb, and 1 folded notice from the county road board with a penciled remark in a hand that was not official. "Crossing preferred if spring flow remains reliable." My father kept every scrap that hinted somebody in town might one day admit we mattered, Nora said. Night came windless and white under a near-full moon. Eli sat on the porch with the rifle over his knees while Nora reheated coffee that tasted faintly of yesterday's ashes. She spoke at last of her husband Samuel, a schoolteacher one winter and harness mender the next because farming alone would not meet them halfway. After he died, she said, people got kinder with their voices and crueler with their expectations. They talked to me like I'd become weather, something to plan around, not with. Eli answered with Lucy's story because the dark asks for less performance than daylight does. Ben's scream tore the night apart. They hit the yard running. One rider was cutting south with a struggling body slung in front of his saddle. Another had set the chicken coop going with a kerosene rag. A third was driving the milk goats through the open gate just for damage. Chaos is a good thief's helper. Eli fired once into the ground before the rider carrying Ben, and dirt burst under the horse's nose. He shied hard. Ben slipped sideways, hanging by one arm. Nora ran straight under hoof danger and caught her brother's shirt as he fell, dragging him clear into the dust. The rider wheeled back and Eli recognized the hollow-eyed hand from Voss's first visit. The man raised his revolver. In the small still beat before the shot, Eli saw he was aiming high. The bullet chewed the porch rail. Eli closed the distance, seized the man's boot, and yanked him from the saddle so hard he hit shoulder first and lost the gun before he lost the breath. The court-wrist rider came from the side and lashed Eli's forearm open with the buckle. Eli drove him straight into the trough, silver water leaping over the rim, and held him under once. Just once, enough to instruct him about deeper outcomes, before smashing his jaw against the edge. Nora had the shotgun now. Her blast shattered the lantern on the third rider's saddle and plunged that end of the yard into darkness. Then hoofbeats sounded beyond the south fence and Harlan Voss reined up where moonlight could touch his buttons without fully showing his face. He had come late enough to keep his own hands clean if the work had gone better. "Mercer," he called, smooth as ever. "You've mistaken a local debt for your personal war." Eli stood dripping from the trough, blood running warm down his arm. "Looks personal from where I'm standing." Voss told him to bring the boy and woman inside, sleep on it, and meet lawful company at dawn. Nora asked whether setting fires had grown lawful. Voss answered, "Prove who lit them." That was the true measure of his power. Not brute force, but distance cleverly worn. The hollow-eyed rider, still on the ground, started to say something to him. Voss cut him off with two cold words. "Get up." The rider did not move. Voss looked at the yard, at Nora with the shotgun, at Ben bleeding from a scrape across the temple, at the captured men in the dust, and chose retreat dressed as composure. He turned his horse and rode off. They stamped out the coop fire, tied the two men in the barn, and got Ben inside. The scrape on his head looked worse than it was, but the shaking in his hands lasted longer. Nora washed the blood away with water gone pink in the basin while Eli stood in the kitchen doorway feeling the pulse of his own cut arm. When she looked up and saw the forearm he had been trying not to examine, she said, "Sit down. It needs stitching." He told her half the county needed the same. She answered, "Your arm first," and set the lamp close. She threaded a curved mending needle from the housewife by the stove and worked with the practical tenderness of women who have spent years using ordinary things for extraordinary hurt. "Samuel," she said while setting the first stitch, used to sew pages back into school readers for the children because a useful thing deserved repair even if nobody admired the seam. Then, without looking at him, she added, "You don't mend a torn thing by hiding the rip." The room held that sentence like a lamp holds flame. Ben had fallen asleep on the settle, one hand still curled as if it expected to wake fighting. Eli reached into his bedroll and drew out a small silver concho on a leather thong, tarnished with pocket wear. Lucy's. He had carried it 10 years because grief makes relics of what common sense would call trinkets. "Give it to Ben," he said. Nora took it carefully. Her fingers brushed his. "Warm, work rough, alive. I'm not sure Luck knows our address," she said. "Then call it Remembrance." She slipped it around Ben's neck. He touched it once without waking. Near midnight, one of the captured riders asked for water. The hollow-eyed one. "Wait." Eli took the dipper to the barn while Nora watched from the kitchen with the shotgun low across her arms. In lantern light, Wade looked scarcely older than 22. Shame had finally reached his face and made it young. Eli asked why he had aimed high. Wade said the boy cried the way his little brother used to. And yet you came, Eli answered. Wade stared at the dirt. His mother owed at Voss's store, he said. His wages mostly cleared against it. Mostly. The whole range lived on that ugly word. After a long silence, he admitted there was a second ledger in Voss's south office. Not the handsome one shown in town. The real one. Charges he meant to add when the railroad stakes made the crossing valuable. Notes on what papers to take from Nora so numbers could be made to say whatever he needed. Will you say that tomorrow where people can hear it? Eli asked. Wade shut his eyes. If he did, Voss would ruin his folks. If you don't, Eli said. He ruins these. Back in the kitchen, Nora spread the surviving receipts and Samuel's last payment slip under the lamp. The bank stamp was clear, and Peebles had written the amount out longhand beneath it in his own neat, rat-like script. If Voss's ledger omits this, it helps, she said. Not enough. Helps. She rubbed at her temple and let the truth of her exhaustion show him at last. I hate building hope on frightened men. Eli said he did too. She looked at him then with no caution left except the ordinary kind that keeps any damaged heart alive. Something shifted between them, not romance yet, only recognition. Two people old enough to understand that hope is expensive, deciding whether to spend it anyway. If that landed somewhere tender in you, then this is the place to give the story a like and subscribe, because people don't come back to these fireside roads for gun smoke alone. They come back for the quiet proof that gentleness can survive hard country and still matter by morning. Dawn brought more company than Voss had expected. Ruiz arrived with a length of chain and a hammer, claiming he had come to fix a hinge. Mrs. Doherty came with a basket and the air of a woman willing to confuse hospitality with witness if it would help. The telegraph girl's uncle, who sat on the county road board, found cause to inspect the crossing marker below the spring. Even Reverend Pike came, hoping prayer might spare him the need for courage and discovering, by degrees, that it might not. Nora set biscuits on the table and told Eli she could still pay only the $2 they had agreed on for the windmill and the shoeing, not a cent more until calves sold. Ben, with Lucy's concho bright at his throat, watched Eli over the rim of his cup. Eli answered that $2 was enough. Not because he didn't want more, but because taking the shape of gratitude she could not afford would have made the whole thing ugly. In the doorway, Ruiz heard it and said nothing. He just hung the chain by the wall and went back outside carrying a different opinion of Eli than the one he had come with. Voss rode in with Sheriff Cutter, Peebles, and 3 fresh hands. He took in the extra people without changing expression, but Eli saw the arithmetic begin behind his eyes. Bullies like empty rooms. Cutter dismounted and announced the inventory in the voice of a man hoping the length of his words might substitute for courage. Nora stepped onto the porch with the receipts in one hand and Samuel's old schoolmaster spectacles in the other. Then do it where every number can be heard, she said. They counted the mules, the milk cows, the chickens reduced by the fire, the damaged structures, the fields, the road access. Voss named values like verdicts. Nora corrected what she could. Peebles mopped his lip. Ruiz tapped his hammer on iron every now and then, a small sound like a clock insisting that time itself was paying attention. Then Wade came out of the barn. No one had seen Eli loosen the knot on his ankles except perhaps Nora, and she had looked away in that deliberate, useful manner by which decent people sometimes help justice begin. Wade stepped into the yard pale as paper, hat in both hands. "Sheriff," he said, and his voice broke only once. "There's another book." Cutter frowned. Wade said it was in the south office, in Voss's private desk, and that it showed charges not yet applied because Voss had meant to wait until the crossing value rose. It also showed instructions to take Mrs. Talley's papers because papers made trouble. Harlan Voss turned slowly. "You drunken fool." Wade flinched but stayed standing. Mrs. Doherty set her basket down hard enough for the tin pie plate to ring. The roadboard uncle said, very mildly, "Crossing value rises?" Funny phrase unless a man heard more railroad talk than the rest of us. Nora held up Samuel's stamped payment slip and asked Peebles whether the bank had received that amount. Peebles looked from the paper to Voss to the dozen watching faces and discovered, all at once, the useful side of cowardice. "I did stamp it," he admitted. "Was it entered?" Nora asked. No one answered. Sheriff Cutter's mustache twitched. He was not a brave man, but neither was he a stupid one, and the yard no longer offered him the privacy on which stupidity thrives. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I'm going to need to inspect that south office before proceeding." It was a small sentence, but it cracked the day open. Voss could have shouted, threatened, lied harder, drawn on the old authority of money and bearing. Instead, he chose the only surrender a man like him can endure. He smoothed his glove cuff and said, "Very well. Inspect your office, Sheriff. I prefer settled matters to noisy ones. Retreat, dressed as dignity." The look on Nora's face did not change. She had gone past triumph and into something steadier. The simple relief of no longer being disbelieved. By mid-afternoon, Cutter returned from the south office with 2 ledgers, one clean and one foul. The private book held everything Wade had promised. Invented storage fees, breeding charges after the bull's death, notes against future railroad value, and a line about removing the tally chest so supporting papers would disappear. That was enough to suspend the claim on the land at once, and enough, later, for hearings that would strip Voss of more than he had counted on. Not all. Men like him rarely lose everything they deserve. But enough. More important, every soul in Dry Creek now knew the shape of the lie. Once a town has seen the trick, it becomes harder to sell it back to them. No one called the evening that followed a celebration, because people who have lived near loss do not trust joy that arrives too quickly. Still, food appeared. Ruiz brought smoked beef, Mrs. Doherty a peach pie, Reverend Pike a prayer less timid than the ones he usually offered. Peebles sent a crate of lamp oil with no note attached, which was as close to repentance as his kind generally comes. Voss did not return. The next day he sent the stolen chest back in a wagon, untouched but dusty, with the mare's halter on top. The mare herself limped home before dawn 2 mornings later, sore and hungry but alive. Ben cried when he saw her and denied it afterward with the grave dignity of boys on the edge of manhood. The County Road Board confirmed the crossing below Tally Spring for future rail access before winter. That public fact did what argument alone could not. Once the road mattered openly to too many interests, Voss could no longer treat Nora's place as a lonely corner fit for private pressure. Men began doing business around him instead of through him. One rancher canceled a breeding contract. Ruiz refused him forge credit. A cattle buyer took coffee at another table in the hotel. Small losses each one, but that is how irrelevance starts. Not with thunder, but with chairs turning away. Eli stayed through fence repairs, then through calf shipping, then through the first hard freeze because leaving kept finding practical reasons to wait. Nora did not ask him for forever. That was part of why forever became possible. She asked instead whether he knew how to ease alkali out of a pump valve, whether Ben's seat in the saddle would improve if he quit gripping with his knees, whether all trail coffee tasted like burned fence posts or whether he brewed his that way to punish decent women. Affection, when it came in chores, in shared glances over failed biscuits, in the easy borrowing of each other's weariness. Ben watched it arrive the way children watch whether they have prayed for but do not entirely trust until it has settled in for good. One cold evening, months later, Eli found Nora on the porch sanding the splintered section of rail where Wade's bullet had chewed through. "I thought you wanted to leave that scar," he said. "I do," she answered. "I just don't want it snagging sleeves forever." He leaned on the post beside her and looked out over the lower meadow now silver under frost. "That about sums up most healing I've ever seen." She smiled without looking up. "Maybe." Then, after a silence large enough to tell the truth in, she said she had spent 2 years believing safety meant never needing anyone enough to be left by them. Eli answered that he had spent 10 years believing leaving first spared everybody something. The wind moved through the cottonwoods with a dry whisper. No speeches followed. None were needed. He kissed her with one gloved hand still resting on the porch rail, like a man asking the world for permission only after he had already chosen his side of it. She kissed him back with the steadiness of someone opening a door from the inside. Winter made the house smaller and dearer. Smoke lifted blue from the chimney on white mornings. Ben wore Lucy's concho on Sundays and during lessons alike. Eli read from Samuel's school readers in a voice roughened by disuse while Nora mended by lamplight and corrected his pronunciation when pride required it. Wade came once in late January with honest wages from another county and paid fair for a currycomb. Nora sold it to him fair and no lower. Charity would have bent him. Fair dealing made him stand straight. By March the calves were dropping sound, the spring still talking beneath the cottonwoods and Talley Crossing, because that is what people had begun calling it with no meeting and no formal vote, had become the kind of place travelers mentioned with respect instead of pity. Come planting time, Eli saddled his gelding for town and stood by the gate longer than necessary, feeling old road habits turn in him like fish under dark water. Ben, lankier now and bolder, said, "If you're going, go. If you're not, quit making the horse think on it." Nora laughed then, open and full, and the sound undid the last knot of wandering in Eli's chest. He took the bridle off, hung it back on the peg, and went to help her set tomato starts behind the kitchen where the boards held a little extra heat. It was not a grand declaration. It was better. It was a man choosing the life in front of him with both eyes open. Years later, yes, years, because some endings ought to have enough time behind them to prove they were true. Travelers coming off the county road at dusk would sometimes see a woman on the porch shelling peas, a boy grown nearly into a man mending tack with his head bent serious over the work, and a cowboy by the pump laughing under his breath because the handle had stuck again and the woman on the porch had been right about the washer size all along. And when the long evening light laid gold across the lower meadow and the spring kept talking softly beneath the cottonwoods, Nora would look at the life built there not by ease but by staying, and know at last that home was just the place that finally kept its word. Next time, if you've a mind to ride with me again, I'll tell you about the widow who paid $2 for a blind horse and found a thief's secret stitched into the saddle lining. Until then, keep your lamp low, your coffee warm, and your heart open for the people who prove themselves by staying.